Well, welcome to Dairy Livestream. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, managing editor of Horde's Dairyman. We are broadcasting from our Cheese Cave, our downtown studio in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, at the historic W.D. Horde & Sons Company building commissioned by Wisconsin Governor W.D. Horde. We have 4 great panelists and look forward to answering your questions in the second half of our Dairy Livestream webcast. You may ask a question by submitting it to the GoToWebinar question panel. I'd also like to remind our audience to ask questions early to ensure we have time here in the Cheese Cave to get them sorted out and pointed to the right panelist as we delve through the topic, can we improve federal milk marketing orders? This talk wraps into our 5-part Dairy Livestream series on milk pricing and potential federal milk marketing order reform. The March 7 Dairy Livestream, Let's Unpack Block and Barrel Cheese Pricing with Ted Jacoby, Kurt Eprick, and Mark Stevenson can be found at www.hordes.com. Select webcasts from the drop-down menu to view this impressive lead episode in the series just a month ago. We followed that up with our March 24 Dairy Livestream, What's the Balance Between Retail and Farmgate Prices with Mike Brown, Jeff Schwager, and Andy Novakovic. That webcast also can be found at www.hordes.com. Today we'll have a robust discussion on can we improve federal milk marketing orders. With 4 guests in the wings, let's go straight to our first poll question. What year was the very first federal milk market order established in St. Louis, Missouri? Your options are 1936, 1940, 1946, and 1950. So we'll go ahead and give about 10 seconds to answer that one. We're getting a lot of correct answers on that. And we'll go ahead and close that poll. And the correct answer, 1936. So many years ago. All of our panelists have extensive experience working with federal milk marketing orders. Our first guest, Tom Wagner, started his career working for the University of Minnesota, the New York State Senate, and the United States Department of Agriculture. For the past 15 years, Tom has worked for Land O'Lakes, the nation's 3rd largest dairy cooperative when ranked on member milk. He started out in a role as dairy economist and then took the lead as Director of Governance and Leader Development for Land O'Lakes. Tom, when it comes to a discussion of potential federal order reform, tell us what might be some options.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I think the challenge for all of us is going to be able to stay at a level that we can have a conversation rather than delve into the deep nerve endings of federal milk orders, which is certainly mind-numbingly detailed and filled with arcane language, and I say that respectfully. What I want to say right out from the front that my comments don't represent Land O'Lakes' position on federal orders. That's not what I'm trying to do today. They reflect my experience, with USDA and with dairy programs, and as an employee of Land O'Lakes working on dairy policy. So with that, one thing I want to say is that there are some great things about federal orders, and one of them probably that we don't appreciate, except when you really get into the work of it, is the data, outstanding data, pounds of milk, uses of milk, sources of milk. I am always impressed. I actually, when I worked for USDA, I'm going to give a plug for Dairy Market News, one of the best sources of information. I know, Corey, you draw on it quite a bit. Best, most timely sources of information. So with that, and maybe kind of to follow up on that in terms of how do we improve federal milk orders, I think to the extent that we can simplify the pricing. And what I mean by that is, and I'll joke about how I wasn't in the dairy industry when PPDs were crafted, but PPDs are a complex, kind of twist that I don't think it's overly impossible to explain them. What causes them is a whole nother issue. But I think the idea, could we make it a little simpler so we wouldn't have that negative deduct on a milk check, which is an alarm. It would be an alarm to my father, it would be an alarm to any dairyman. But I think more important than that is the more we can simplify so that the markets, both markets on the class 1 side and the class 3-4 side, too included, align a little bit more in timing. That might really help in some respects because it means easier hedging. And I think more hedging at the dairy producer level which we really, really moved ahead of recently, will really result in durable dairy farms, sustainable dairy farms. So simplify would probably be my first one. The second one is something that's not controversial at all. It's make allowances. It's something that people tug and pull at, and I'm joking. It is an important topic to discuss because the higher the make allowance, the more milk price goes down in those classified pricings. As I sat through annual hearings, frankly, in California about make allowances, one of the things I always tried to make sure people understood, and particularly our dairy members, it's a balance. My job, maximize the value of federal milk marketing orders to the dairy cooperative and to the dairy members. And same story in California when the CDFA was in existence. So my thought on improving federal milk orders around make allowances, perhaps we learned something in California about the annual updating. The idea that we look at what it costs to make these commodity products on an annual basis, and we have a discussion about them rather than wait 16 years. I think they're a little outdated there, and not trying to make light of it. I think it's an important topic. Is there some indexing that could possibly be used so that we don't need to go back to hearing? Those are a couple immediate thoughts. There's myriad other things that we can do, but again, thank you for the opportunity. And in my mind, federal orders are an important component of refereeing, as you'll hear Aaron talk about. And that's as important as anything. There's some transparency and data there as well. So those are my starts on a discussion I'm looking forward to continuing.
Thank you, Tom. As a reminder to our audience, as you hear from our panelists today on federal orders, please submit your questions to the GoToWebinar question panel. Also, each of our dairy live stream webcasts are archived the very next day on the Hordes Dairyman website and our YouTube channel. Before we invite our next guest to Dairy Livestream, let's go to another poll question. The number of federal orders peaked at what number in 1963? Your options, they roll on the tens: 53, 63, 73, or 83. So go ahead and answer that question. And we are getting some questions. Speaking of poll questions, we're getting some good questions in from our audience here, and we'll assign those to our guests. So let's go ahead and cut that poll off. And our answers were almost equally distributed, but the peak was 1963 was 83 federal orders. So we've done a lot of consolidation here, and we'll bring up that modern number here in our next poll question. But first, we welcome Kelvin Covington to Dairy Livestream. Kelvin brings a unique perspective on both multiple component pricing and fluid milk. Kelvin began his career at the National All Jersey and later as CEO of its sister organization, the American Jersey Cattle Association, where Kelvin advocated for multiple component pricing. When that journey began, multiple component pricing was largely a new concept. Today, the vast majority of U.S. milk, 90+%, is calculated by Mark Stevenson, is priced using multiple component pricing formulas. Kelvin went on to become CEO of Southeast Milk based in Bellevue, Florida. Of course, the Florida market has the largest Class 1 utilization in the nation, and by that I mean the grand majority of the milk goes to beverage milk. Kelvin, you have studied federal orders as long as anyone on today's Dairy Livestream. What is your perspective?
Thank you, Corey, for the opportunity to be on this podcast, and good morning to everyone. I want to share with you my list of 4 items in general terms that I see areas that we can improve when it comes to federal milk marketing orders. The first item on my list is that we need to use the administrative process instead of the legislative process. If we look back the last couple of years ago, when Congress got involved in trying to legislate the change in the Class 1 mover, I'm just going to be perfectly blunt with you. When Congress gets involved, they have a tendency to mess it up. And I think that's a challenge we have now, the Class 1 mover, that I'll talk with in a few minutes. But the reason I really push using the administrative process is that it allows all parties to have a say at the table. I through the hearing process and so forth, you can present your point of view. And Corey, as you mentioned, I've been involved with federal milk marketing orders now probably over 40 years. I've been involved in writing proposals, participating in hearings, and so forth. And when the Dairy Division releases their recommended decision, there's been some decisions that I have agreed with and some decisions I've disagreed with. But I can say with all confidence, even those that I disagreed with, when you read what the Dairy Division people wrote, they did listen to all parties and provided you of why they went to the direction they did. So I encourage it going forth, any improvements made in the federal order system, that we use the administrative process because it allows all people to be involved. The second item on my list, when we look at improving federal milk marketing orders, is we need to go back and look at what the purpose of orders are. The number one purpose, and it's been intact for a long, long time through the order system, is that the federal order should encourage the movement of and an adequate supply of fluid milk for drinking purposes or to go into class 1. And for a long, long time, even up to 1980, over 60% of the milk in the federal order system was used in class 1 and fluid. Even at the turn of the century, when federal order reform went in, it was still over 40% went into class 1. Well, now we're down to less than 30. And if we keep it our current trend rate, very likely when we get to 10 years from now, it very likely could be less than 20%. So what I'm saying, when we look at the purpose of federal milk marketing orders, maybe one shoe doesn't fit all sizes. That maybe the federal milk marketing orders in the Southeast, where I live and work mostly now, where it's still a fluid market, that purpose works. But maybe in other federal milk marketing orders, we need to look at what a different purpose of what we want the orders to, how they want them to function, what we want them to accomplish. And I would encourage all dairy farmers, as we're looking at making changes to federal milk marketing orders, sit down and decide what you want them to accomplish. Again, it's so difficult to get where you're going if you don't know how you're going to get there. And if we can have, good solid purposes of what you want the orders to do, and we have to keep in mind they got to comply with the Agriculture Adjustment Act. Maybe some things you might have to take a different direction that orders can't do. But if you can decide where you want them to go, it's going to make a whole lot easier to make those improvements. So that's my second thing. My third thing when it comes to improvements in federal orders is who can participate in the orders, pooling, performance requirements. There's room there to have more equity and a fairer system of who participates in the orders. Again, looking from the fluid perspective, if a dairy farmer markets their milk to a fluid processor, that fluid processor has to be regulated under the federal milk marketing order system. And generally, where the class 1 price is the highest price in the order system, the dairy farmer who sends their milk there doesn't get all that money. They have to share in the pool. A lot of times it can be with farmers not marketing milk to a fluid market, but yet it provides a reserve supply for the fluid market. Yet for dairy farmers that are marketing their milk to non-regulated plants, they had a decision if they want to be in the pool or out of the pool. And as we know, we've had a lot of depooling here over the last year because it hasn't been proper to do so. And again, they only get back in the pool when it is profitable. So money comes out, but no money goes back in from those producers. So looking ahead, there needs to be some kind of stability. You're either in or out. If you're going to be out, you need to stay out for a period of time. If you're going to be in, you need to be in to make the system more fair and equitable. But the fourth item on my list is pricing. Tom has already made reference to it. If you look over the history of federal milk marketing orders, we've had a variety of different ways for price discovery or how we get at prices. Many, many years ago, it's hard to believe, we used condensed milk, which was a long, long time ago. But things change. And then, as most of you know, we had the survey of unregulated plants, the old Minnesota-Wisconsin price series. And now today, since federal order reform, we entered a system I like to call in-product pricing. To me, the methodology of that system is sound, it works, it's explainable. But as Tom mentioned earlier, maybe we need to have some tweaks and updates to it of the numbers that go in there. And maybe we need to have a process where they're looked at on a more regular basis rather than waiting for such length of time between when we make some changes or so forth. And while we're on pricing, again, I have to go back to Class 1. I'm a strong advocate when it comes to the Class 1 mover that we need to go back to the higher up. If you go back and read the decision back in federal order reform, the Dairy Division looked at using the average, but they made real good arguments that why we needed to have the higher of for Class 1, it gets milk to its highest use, encourage milk to go into fluid. And other than, not getting milk that's raised with proper use or to Class 1, in our part of the country over the past several months or past year or so, that change has lowered the blend price in the 3 Southeast orders about $1 a hundredweight, which is real money. And then the final thing when it comes to Class 1, I know a controversial issue, it's always been anything on changing orders is Class 1 differentials. But in my opinion, they need to be looked at again, and we need to start including some factors in setting those Class 1 differentials other than just moving milk to where it's needed, but also the cost in serving that fluid market because it's becoming more and more costly to serve a fluid milk market. So Corey, in summary, 4 areas for improvement: use the administrative process instead of legislative process. Maybe we don't need to have the same purpose for federal orders throughout the country. Maybe we need to have some regional differences because each region is a little different. We need to look at the pooling to make it more fair and equitable. I think the current pricing structure of in-product pricing is sound and logical, but it probably needs some tweaks and updates and maybe need to be made on a more regular basis. So that's the 4 areas I see for improvements, and appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Calvin. Very thorough and easy to follow. I appreciate the comments. Before we invite Aaron to our dairy live stream, let's go to another poll question. These days, the U.S. has how many federal orders? 5, 11, 15, or 21? Pick the right answer. So far, we just changed from 100%. We're bouncing around a little bit here, but this is a good question here to show how we have consolidated orders, and as the infrastructure of the United States has improved, and we're talking about the federal highway system here. So we'll go ahead and close that off. The correct answer, 73% of you got it right. It is 11 orders, and that includes California. Changing or amending a federal order is an elaborate undertaking. With that in mind, we welcome Aaron Taylor to Dairy Livestream. Aaron has worked with USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, which many of us simply call AMS, for 20 years. AMS, Aaron serves as the Director for Order Formulation and Enforcement Division. Aaron, welcome to Dairy Livestream. And what can you tell us about the roadmap to changes when it comes to federal orders?
Thanks, Corey. I'm happy to be here. I always appreciate being invited to have USDA participate in these conversations about how federal orders can be improved and the process for doing so. So generally, we look at federal orders. They're a system of rules for buyers and sellers when it comes to buying and selling milk. And USDA's role is to act as the referee and make sure all parties are abiding by the rules. So there is a whole process, as Corey alluded to amending these provisions, what I want to go over. This process is specified in our authorizing legislation. It's a very formal process. Marketing orders are one of the very few types of government regulations that uses this formal process to amend its regulations. This process does allow for maximum transparency, and it also facilitates maximum participation to ensure producer, handler, and consumer perspectives are considered. So amending a federal order, all of that is always initiated by the industry. Anyone can submit a proposal to amend a federal order. It does not just need to be a producer group. Anyone's welcome to do that. But all proposals must answer a set of questions. Those are set in regulation. And those questions are meant to flesh out what's the proposal meant to do, what's the issue it's there to address, How is it supposed to operate? And how can the producers, handlers, and consumers, how could they be impacted by such change? Once a proposal is formally submitted to the department, it does not mean that we move forward necessarily with a hearing. We take all that information provided, we look at the proposal and determine, do we even have the legislative authority to implement such a change? Does it fit within the framework of the Agricultural Marketing Agreement Act? And then whether the issue it's seeking to address is something that needs to be further explored. So if USDA, we decide to move forward with a proceeding, we'll publish a hearing notice to say this is when the hearing is, and these are the proposals which we will hear. Once this formal process starts, USDA employees are prohibited from having private conversations regarding the merits of the proposal or any of the issues it seeks to address. It's formally referred to as ex parte restrictions. In practice, that means there is no off-the-record conversations that happen in regards to any of these proposals. Everything must be discussed on the record in public in this formal proceeding. For anyone who's never attended a rulemaking hearing, they're run very much like a court proceeding. We have a presiding official, like a judge, who oversees the hearing. They're tasked with, among other things, swearing in witnesses, rulings on any motions that are heard during the hearing, and receiving evidence into the record. We have sworn witness testimony at a rulemaking hearing. Anyone can testify. It doesn't just have to be a producer or a handler. Consumers are welcome to come and testify in regards to the proposals being heard. But anyone that testifies is subject to cross-examination by anyone else present at the hearing. As I mentioned earlier, only evidence submitted in the public record can be used when making a determination. So these hearings are very important to gather all the evidence needed. Once we do that and the hearing concludes, the department, we take that evidence back, we comb through it, and we use that to make our determination on if a change needs to happen. Now, what's important to weigh is that the statute tasks USDA with balancing all perspectives when making a change. Not just the producer perspective, not just the handler perspective, but all perspectives, producer, handlers, and consumers. And based on those, we look at the record and make a recommendation that's founded with an economic justification for change. And so USDA will issue a recommended decision based on what we gathered. We accept public comments, and then we take those comments back and consider them and then issue what we call a final decision. And it is this final decision which producers vote on. And I gonna go through a little bit about how the voting process works. So only producers marketing milk in the impacted marketing orders vote. And it's one producer, one vote. And what's important to note is that when producers vote, they're voting on the entire order as amended. They're not just voting on the amendment. It's a package deal. This process is provided for in our statute. And as I said before, right, the decision of the secretary is based on the evidence presented at the hearing. So if the secretary finds that a change is needed in order to operate properly, he or she cannot allow producers, which are the only parties to vote, to pick and choose what amendments they want. It's a package. The order is amended to provide for the orderly marketing conditions going forward. So the statute also specifically allows for cooperatives to block vote on behalf of their membership. That's an option for the co-op. The co-op's run by farmers. The board members are dairy farmer members, and they choose whether to block vote on behalf of all of their members, or they may choose to ask us to send ballots to all their members separately, and then those members can choose whether or not to return the individual ballots. A decision passes when 2/3 of the producers or producers representing 2/3 of the milk in the vote in the affirmative. What's important here is only those ballots returned are counted. So if you receive a ballot, but it's not sent back, that ballot doesn't count in the yay or the nay column. So for example, if we send out 500 ballots and we only get 300 back, then we need 2/3 of that 300 ballots for the order as amended to pass. If the vote passes, then we move forward to implement the change. If the vote fails, then we move forward to terminate the order because the order as amended was not approved by producers. We do have a detailed step-by-step process on our website available for all to look at. Generally, this whole process takes anywhere from 12 to 18 months from start to finish. And so it can be lengthy, but at the same time, it's based on maximum transparency and maximum participation. And I think that is a big benefit to the way we amend our order system. And Corey, the final item I wanted to touch on is kind of answering a question we get often. When do you do a regional hearing? When do you do a national hearing? So that's up to the department to determine. We have that flexibility, and we look at the proposal and whether it's amending a provision that's maybe subject only to a certain one particular order or to a national order uniformly. So for example, pooling provisions and shipping standards, those are targeted towards the local market. And so if we got a proposal in to change those provisions, more than likely that would be a local regional hearing. If we got a proposal in that says wants to look at the classifications of milk, well, that's uniform on all 11 orders. So that would be more of a national hearing because a change in that provision would affect everybody. So hopefully I've provided you with a little or maybe too much information when it comes to the process. And Corey, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Erin. In this theme of baseball, Erin and her team would be the umpires and those that are working the ball diamond throughout the baseball field when it comes to this process of federal order reform. As a reminder, go ahead and type in your questions to the GoToWebinar control panel. We have a number of them here, and hopefully we can get through them all. Very thoughtful questions. Some have easy answers and some do not. Before we hear from Andy Novakovic, let's go to our final poll question. What percent of U.S. milk is marketed through federal orders prior to COVID-19? 60%, 70%, 80%, or 90%? So go ahead and answer that question. We'll give everyone a little bit of time to do that. The responses are rolling in here real quickly. And let's go ahead, Caitlin, and cut that poll off here. And the correct answer is 70%, 28% of you got that right. That number is, I rounded them to even numbers here, so it's a little higher than that, but it's not approaching 80%. We welcome back Cornell's Distinguished Professor Emeritus, Andy Novakovic, to Dairy Livestream. Andy, we're having this critical discussion today regarding federal orders. And Andy, in the theme of spring baseball, you are our cleanup hitter. Please help us plate some runs on this topic of federal milk marketing orders. Andy.
Yeah, so in the interest of time, I'm going to do my best to be brief, but I'd like to step back a little bit, and I suppose it's a little academic, but I'd like to try to get at the question of what are federal orders designed to do, and by implication also what they're not designed to do. First, one little bit of federal order baseball trivia. I'll put together your first poll question and your last poll question. In the 1960s, after it peaked at 83 orders and was already kind of coming down, was when the federal order system first reached as much as half of the U.S. milk supply. Federal orders are voluntary. The federal legislation is what's called permissive. It allows it to happen, but it doesn't force it on anybody. Erin and her colleagues don't sit around saying, by golly, I think Idaho needs to be back in the system. We're gonna get those buggers in. It doesn't work that way. And as we saw with California, they had to ask to be in, and Erin was nice enough to let them, but nevertheless, it is permissive. And so the system was in place for over 20 years before you got up to half of the milk supply. As Tom said, and I think Erin punctuated, federal milk marketing orders are basically a large book of rules that govern the pricing of milk for plants that are subject to regulation. Not every plant necessarily is. It is, federal orders are fundamentally about the question how, not the question what. It doesn't determine what the price of milk should be in some value judgment sense. Erin does not have the authority to sit down and say, oh, those poor farmers, I think maybe we ought to give them a little bit more money. Nor can she sit down and say, oh, those poor processors are paying too much, maybe we ought to give them a discount. It's a framework about how prices will be determined and communicated, and the rules of the game in that umpire system. The question might arise, how on earth did we ever come to this sort of a price regulation? Did a bunch of politicians or a bunch of USDA people sat down and said, let's inflict some rule book on the dairy industry? And in point of fact, the system of federal orders hinges on two pretty simple ideas: classified pricing and pooling. Classified pricing, meaning buyers have different prices depending on what they do with milk. Fluid guy pays class 1, cheese guy pays class 3. And pooling, which means if you're going to have different buyers paying different prices, you don't necessarily want the individual supplier who sent his milk to class 1 to just get that high price, and the guy that sent his milk to the Land O'Lakes butter plant gets the class 4 price. So pooling is the sharing of revenue. Really, you can lose yourself in the weeds of federal orders, but classified pricing and pooling is actually a pretty simple concept. That concept was created by dairy marketing cooperatives in the Boston marketing area in 1890. Emphasis on the number 18, 19th century, over 100 years ago, 40 years, an adult working lifetime before they were put into federal legislation. They were put together because the cooperatives that were marketing milk in that urban area at that point in our history recognized that consumers of drinking milk, beverage milk, were more tolerant of a higher price. We're less likely to not drink milk if the price went up than consumers of butter, which was actually the number 2 product at that point in our history, or cheese or any other product. And the concept they had was, could we come up with a system where we leaned a little more heavily on pricing that milk that goes into the fluid market, taking advantage of that consumer tolerance, and then, set the price wherever it has to be to make the rest of the milk go away into cheese and butter and all these other products. And then, of course, pooling was to make sure that all the farmers would buy into that system, and you didn't create an inequity in how farmers' milk was priced. And that tumbled along pretty well for quite a while. By the time we got into the 1930s and Congress was starting to think about intervening in markets more than they had been, there were 60 city markets in the United States of America that were using some form of classified pricing and pooling that was under the structure of cooperative marketing. So this was already a familiar system. And the proposition that cooperatives went to Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s with was, we have this great system, however, we lack the muscle to enforce it. If you could be like the train regulators that establish rates for freight on trains, if you could be the guy that says, this is the rule and this is how it's going to work, and then had the police power, not in the sense of a badge, but the ability to enforce of the U.S. government, oh my gosh, that would just really help us out a lot. But we've got the right system, but we just don't have the muscle. And of course, in the 30s, things were such a mess, it opened the door to that kind of regulation. And over time, from St. Louis all the way up to Sacramento, it has since evolved and grown. What does it do? It's a system of rules. It says this is how the system is going to work. It is not a price support. Sometimes when I go out to meetings, somebody would say, well, darn federal orders, they don't guarantee me a cost of production. True, guilty as charged. They were never designed to guarantee you that you would get the cost of production. Maybe they should have, but they don't. We had a price support program that worked a little bit more that way. That doesn't happen anymore. It really hasn't been working since the 1990s. We've got dairy margin coverage, which tries to help you out when prices are bad, especially relative to feed prices. But that's a whole different ballgame. It's a whole different part of the USDA building from where Aaron works. Some have said, well, fluid consumption is tanking and cheese is the rock star. Maybe cheese should be class 1. And this is an important point to discuss. It really doesn't have anything to do with the volume of milk in a class. It's really back to this fundamental question of what will consumers tolerate? If I load up a bunch of price on cheese, our consumers go, well, shucks, I wish it were otherwise, but I'm going to keep buying this cheese. Or are they going to step back and go, geez, I don't know. If we said, oh boy, fluid milk sales are suffering, we need to put that price down, would people run to the store and buy more milk because there was a discount? People can debate with me, of course, that's always true, but I'm going to say the basic economics hasn't changed. The reason why Class 1 sales are declining is not because the price of milk is too high. It's because they've got different kinds of issues, not the least of which is the percentage of the U.S. population that's under the age of 18 is the smallest it's ever been since the first English guides got off the boat. And so the natural market for that beverage sales is down. It doesn't have anything to do with the price of milk, or at least not enough to make that much of a difference. So the logic is still there, but the power of that lever is just smaller than it's ever been historically. So when we approach the question of what should we do with federal orders, I think we need to also keep in mind a healthy dose of what is the system designed to do? What is it equipped to do? What is it not really equipped to do? And if I need that to be done, where do I go for that kind of help? Because the federal orders won't be able to do it because they're not designed to do it. Back to you, Corey.
Thank you, Andy. We're going to go straight to questions. We have quite a few of them. The first one we're going to deal, probably everyone will start with Tom and Kelvin on this. And a number of people are chiming in here. We all know the elephant in the room caused by largely the conditions involving COVID-19. It's depooling. Depooling has always existed in federal orders, but it was exacerbated by some market conditions that prevailed a lot during the last 9 months of the year last year. One of the questions that comes in here is, how can depooling be justified as it is being used now? Can the orders survive with the majority of milk being pooled only when it is to processors' financial advantage? Now, as we open that up for questions, we also have to remember, as we talk about federal order reform, if you make things too restrictive, like you must or must not be in the pool to qualify for those funds, you may disincentivize processors from even being in it. But let's talk depooling. Tom or Kelvin, you want to grab that one?
Go ahead first if you want to, Tom.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, depooling is certainly, in some respects, it's a logical economic decision by a processor. I don't think there's any doubt. It's nothing inherently evil about depooling. That value is retained with the handler, and the handler decides how to distribute it. Now, I would agree that when depooling starts to shake the, I think the metric of equal payment, in other words, those who are in and those who are out, is vastly different, like we saw during the pandemic. I think it's worth talking about, are there some ways to keep more of that milk in? In fact, when we proposed the California milk order, the promulgation hearing, as we call it, we called it inclusive pooling, because we were concerned about that, moving in and out. And in fact, the reality has occurred that there is a lot of milk that moves in and out of California. You look at other areas, you look at the Northeast, for example, where we have a significant stake. Probably not going to be as much because you've got a big value in that Class 1 market, although we still have a Class 4 stake there like we do in California. So I think depooling is best handled at that local level. You want to look at things about repooling percentages. You might even want to look at a provision that most people don't know about called dairy farmer from another market, where you're retaining those producers in that market longer. The last thing I'd say is the more we can have a depooling decision stretched out over a number of months. In other words, if you take a bunch out now, you can't get back in, that's going to change the decision making and I think add stability to the volume of milk that stays in that pool. Calvin?
Yeah, Tom, I agree with what you said, and the only thing I would add, in my opinion, if someone decides they want to depool, they need to stay out a period of time before they could come back in. Now, what that number of months needs to be, that would be up for debate. And I think that would add some stability, provide some more orderly marketing. And as Tom said, then they would make the decision not just on a month basis, but on several months basis. And I just think that would provide some more fairness and equity in the playing field.
Thank you, Calvin. We're going to take these next two questions to Aaron and Taylor, and there's a couple of them bundled together. I'm going to ask them just as the audience members sent them in. What is the current purpose of quote unquote terminating an order if the order does not pass as amended? Perhaps this aspect should be changed to allow for more open discussion. And another follow-up question from another person, but very much in the same vein. What is the rationale that farmers have to vote on the entire order as amended instead of just amendments to the order? What is the foundation of this in policy law? So Aaron and Andy, let's the two of you take that one. Very important questions, very thoughtful.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. Definitely some important questions. I think, those work in tandem, and the way the statute reads and provides for in voting on the entire order as amended. I kind of go back to when I discussed how the statute makes the department and the secretary consider all perspectives when doing a rulemaking. We're to balance both the producer and the handler and the consumer views that's specified in statute. And we're supposed to make our decisions based on the evidence provided in the hearing. So when we go through that process and the secretary makes a determination that, yes, we need to have changes to the order system to provide for the orderly marketing conditions going forward based on the evidence of the record. And we've weighed at that point all the perspectives in making that determination. Okay, but then when we go to the voting process, it's only producers that vote. So while we've considered all perspective and tried to reach some conclusion that balances those, it's only one party that actually votes on the order to go forward. And so we kind of look at the orders as a package, and the producers, if we allow them to vote just on the amendment, basically you can then just pick and choose what amendments you want to go forward. And that might not be based on any economic reasoning, because we have to weigh the other viewpoints in making that determination. So that's why when the act was designed, it was specifically provided that we vote on the entire order as amended. It's a package deal. All these provisions, they all work together to maintain orderly marketing conditions. So you can't just not change, pull one specific amendment and expect for the rest of the package to work in an orderly process. So that's how we do the order as amended. And because of that, you're voting on the whole package. So it's, yes, I want this whole order. And if I'm voting no, then we terminate. Because essentially, if I vote no, I'm saying, well, the secretary has said the order as it currently stands isn't providing for orderly marketing conditions, and therefore wouldn't be fulfilling the purpose of the act. And therefore, we have to terminate the order. So that's how we look at it in the department. Andy, I don't know what if you can add, I'm sure you can, to that conversation.
Well, actually, I want to highlight one of the last things you said. There's two pieces here. One is it the best? And the other part is best for whom? And your point about farmers get to vote, but you have to balance everyone's interests, that's cherry picking, right? And so when a farmer says, Tom says, Cal says, gosh, you guys made a decision, and this one part, I wish you would have made a different decision. It would have been better for me. Okay, yeah, I mean, everybody that's affected could pick out some part that they didn't, could be better for them, which is cherry picking. But your job is to try to balance all that as best you can. And the notion of we sat down, we looked, we collected a lot of evidence in a painstaking process. Everybody who wanted to talk had an opportunity to talk. We thought all about this very carefully, and we believe that this package, which is different from the last one, is what's going to serve the market the best, which, as you said, by definition means the old one didn't. So going backwards is now not an option. So you get to pick the one that we've decided is best, or go commando, your choice.
Well, we're going to single these questions out to one presenter now because we want to answer as many as possible. Kelvin, you will be up next on this. The question comes in, were there problems specifically with the fluid milk market due to Class 1 not being the highest price in much of 2020? And the short answer is yes, but can you quantify those, Kelvin?
there were some challenges of, and again, 2020, things were messed up. So again, it wasn't a normal year. But on some spot basis, when you're trying to go and get milk for class 1, and when that class 1 price is not as high as it could be to track that milk because you're not using the higher of, what it causes you to do, you have to go in and pay additional premiums or service charges to get that milk above the class 1 price of what you would do normally. So the short answer is yes. And this can keep happening.
Thank you, Calvin. I'm going to send this next question to Andy, but I'm going to answer part of it because I've been thinking a lot about this as I drive to and from work about 40 minutes each way. Question is, in the past, federal order votes, how many votes are submitted by individual farmers and how many are submitted by co-ops via block voting? So due to block voting, do farmers really decide on referendum decisions? I think we get a lot of comments in the Hordes Dairyman by phone call and email and letters that we're a democracy. Now, we also remember that is true, but we are a republic in the United States. If you look at governance, we elect people to the House of Representatives. We elect people to the Senate, and they cast votes on issues on our behalf. A number of us have chosen to market our milk, and when I say us, it's dairy farmers, and the Hordes Dairyman has a farm as well since 1889. We elect people in our co-ops to study these issues and do what they think is best on our behalf. And hence, that's many of the times this block voting has come about. But I'm going to come back to that question. I'm going to kick it over to Andy. In the past federal order votes, how many, we don't need to quantify it, but do farmers really decide on referendum decisions if there's block voting? And my short answer is yes. Andy, additional comments?
Yeah, well, actually, the other folks might be have more specific insights than me, but my comment is this: the act in the 1930s was written to give cooperatives the opportunity to cast a block vote. That was written in by the legislation, and there's no question that cooperatives themselves asked for that provision to be there. That doesn't necessarily mean they exercised that option from the get-go. And it's also the case, USDA does not determine whether or not a cooperative block votes. They say if you want to, you can, but the co-op and its members have to decide to say, we will cast one ballot for all our farmers. The board of directors gets to make that decision. If an individual member thinks that was a bad choice, that's a cooperative issue. That's an issue between you and your cooperative. That's not a USDA issue. And I know that there are farmers who have been upset with choices their cooperatives have made, whether it's investing in a plant or whatever. And as you point out, Corey, that's the way of the world. That's not everything can be done by a unanimous vote. I can also, though, add that a lot of the block voting emphasis really came to a head after World War II, when there started to be more and more of them. And we started to see that orders were being amended, they were being added, they were being consolidated. It was a very fertile time. And a lot of farmers just didn't have the time to sit down and figure out what was going on, and they didn't vote. And it became an issue that cooperatives finally stepped back and said, you know, we're responsible for marketing milk. We have to have people who understand how this system works, who can understand the pieces, know what this means and that means, and to make recommendations, explain it to our members, and then help them understand how to vote. And that led to cooperatives exercising block voting because, as Tom said, it's just too complicated for the average person to really sort through. And yes, you're going to find a time when you thought maybe your co-op made the wrong choice, but maybe at least we should say it was a choice that educated, intelligent people made with your best interest in heart.
And Andy, before, go ahead, Tom.
Just from my perspective, the California promulgation discussion, what preceded was years of discussion with our producers. And I mean, I think that the California producers were as involved, the California Land O'Lakes members were as involved in a discussion and into detail as I've ever seen in my stint in federal orders. So were they all in agreement? Probably not. In fact, I know some who didn't agree, but the vast majority had heard about it. I had more boiled chicken dinners than I can even imagine describing, to just go out and talk about. We've had Aaron partnering out with us, our team coming out and talking about it. So it is something that needs discussion with producers. And I would say from a Land O'Lakes perspective, we took it very seriously, as did my colleagues at CDI and DFA in the California promulgation.
And when Andy uses the word complicated, there are a number of issues that I feel personally are complicated. The question then becomes, how much energy does one as a dairy farmer place into learning it, or do you trust someone else to do it? I mean, I think any of us here, or most of our attendees, can spend a lot of time studying an issue and get up to speed, but how do you balance that time versus what's happening on your dairy farm? So a decision has to be made there as well. This was the first question that came in, and it's a long one, but it's a very thoughtful and creative one. And I'm going to do toss up here, reminding we only got 10 minutes left here, but significant portions of U.S. milk is processed by cooperatives. These cooperatives have boards constituted largely of member owners, and these boards sometimes resist investments to R&D, research and development, which may not have obvious, visible, short-term internal rates of return. So this question's coming from a dairyman here. I want everyone to know this too. It's not a processor. Since other jurisdictions seem to spend more generously on new and innovative product development, would it be reasonable to add an R&D component to the make allowance in the future, where processors would need to provide full evidence of using those funds specifically for this purpose? This is a big picture idea. I don't know if anyone wants to tackle it, but this longtime viewer needed to have that one aired. Anyone want to comment on that one?
Well,
Corey,
that's a pretty interesting question.
But that's okay, since I'm not working full time for a cooperative now, so I can't be fired anymore, and so forth. But I've worked with dairy farmers all my life, and they provided my livelihood, and it's been a good life. But one challenge when you work with dairy farmers, and been in my experience, too often the short-term decisions come to the forefront versus long-term decisions. I know they've got bills to pay, meet payroll, feed bills, and so forth. And that's a good question, because yes, the dairy industry, and especially a lot of processing and manufacturing owned by cooperatives, need to think more long-term. But as a challenge, for dairy farmers, especially if they're struggling to make that long-term investment, I haven't thought about something in the pricing. I mean, part of the promotion money is supposed to go for research and so forth. But I think it's something worth exploring, because generally benefits on research and development help the whole industry. But I guess I get right down to it. It's sort of in my experience, too often cooperatives are more short-term focused than long-term focused, and hopefully that can change some.
Corey, I would just say I think it's an excellent question. Probably not the right answer, though. I wouldn't build it in the make allowance, where you're looking at a Joe commodity product and pretty efficient plant, cost of processing to determine what you can afford to pay farmers as a minimum price. But the question, where can we incentivize investments in dairy foods processing or on dairy farming, is an excellent question that could be a discussion of a whole nother session.
And Andy, I've already, for those of our audience here, well, every 2 or 3 months, Andy, Mark, Chris, and I, and Caitlin here, we go through and propose topics, and we did this 5-part series. What I'm already willing to say today, we're going to have another dairy live stream with the same title, and probably 4 more guests here, because we have a lot of thoughtful questions we're not going to get through today, and we're going to save them for another webcast, because this is an important conversation. This one comes in from someone who studied federal orders quite a bit, and I don't know if there's an answer here, but we're going to do a couple PPD questions here. Would eliminating component pricing based on butter, fat, and protein and other solids get rid of negative PPDs? I think the short answer is it's a lot deeper than that. Anybody willing to grab that one?
Well, the key is not multiple component pricing per se, but rather that my first guess on a blend price is the class 3 price. And the reality is in the 4 federal orders that have butterfat based pricing, the ones that Cal is especially familiar with, plus Arizona, the class 3 price is higher, can be higher than the class 1 price or push pretty close to it, even though you don't have component pricing. That's the fundamental conundrum that goes on. So it's really not about component pricing. It's about establishing the class 3 as my first guess, and then finding out I don't have enough money to pay the class 3. It begs the question, okay, could I have component pricing and guess a different number? And I suppose you could, and we could explore that. Certainly, if you went to butterfat-based pricing, as we used to have, or kind of the new version as it exists in the Southeast, you don't talk about negative PPDs, but that doesn't eliminate the fact that the class 3 price is still a big number compared to the other ones.
Yeah, Corey, if I can add, even in Florida here, a couple months last year, there was a negative producer price differential in Florida as a skim butterfat market, but it wasn't expressed like that on the milk check. The blend price, as Andy mentioned, was lower than the class 3 price. So if you took the difference, that was a negative PPD. All multiple component pricing does is, as I say, it breaks it down and makes it more transparent.
Tom,
Yeah.
you had your, or Aaron,
Corey,
go
if I
ahead.
can add a little bit, the way we like to explain it is the PPDs, it's just math. It's just the accounting mechanism to make sure the money paid in equals the money paid out. And like Andy talked about, we first decided right now we'll first pay you on class 3. Well, at the end of the month, we don't have that much money. There has to be some way to subtract out what we don't have so we come up with a price we can pay everybody fairly. And so that's kind of what the PPD represent. And it's kind of like we can afford to pay everybody, let's say $15, but there's multiple ways to come up to 15. We've just chosen this one way, and for this month, it's a minus to get to the 15.
And Aaron knows well that we really tried to say, hey, we don't need a negative PPD on the milk checks in California. USDA didn't like our idea. But laying that aside, let's go to the source of the negative PPD as more of an issue here. The great difference between 3 and 4 really, really tumbled a lot of stuff. Advanced pricing has something to do with this. The 74-cent mover fixture has something to do with this, and depooling. In my mind, we've got to make sure we understand what we're trying to solve, as opposed to let's get rid of PPDs and everybody will be happy. It's the markets and the way the markets are exemplified through this process.
Tom, I kind of like that analogy when you talked about what was happening in a California order. I think as a manager, you just came out of the bullpen to have a talk with the umpire at home plate there, and they did that with some good jest as well. What we're going to do here is we're going to wrap up Dairy Livestream, and what we're going to promise our audience here is we're going to have another program like this here probably in May here, and we'll get that queued up. We'll save your questions here. We have and this is going to be an ongoing discussion, and I thank the great audience participation and attendance. Our next Dairy Livestream will focus on what processors have learned from the pandemic, and this will roll into this topic again of federal orders and milk pricing. The show will air Wednesday, April 23rd, 2021 at 11 p.m. Central Daylight Time, and will be archived again on the Hordes Dairyman YouTube channel the very next day, just like this episode. We look forward to seeing you then. On behalf of Tom Wagner, Kelvin Covington, Aaron Taylor, and Andy Novakovic, I am Corey Geiger, your host. Thank you for joining us. We wish you all a good day. Thank you, everyone.